thank you everybody for joining us for this webinar on the RAISE guidelines, also called Responsible AI in Evidence Synthesis. This is hosted by the EAHIL Special Interest Group in Evidence-Based Information. My name is Jane Falconer. I'm the co-chair of the group and I work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I'm going to be facilitating this webinar. Before I introduce our speakers, I've got a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, the webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes. The first section will be a presentation with some interactive elements by our speakers. And then after that, I'll open the floor to questions. If this is your first time hearing about EAHIL and the special interest groups, then welcome. You can join us if you want to, just by going to the webpage there and choosing the join option. It's free to join us. And as well as the special interest groups, we also have our annual conference and workshops. And our conference next year is in Turkey in June. So yeah, it would be great to see you there. Okay, so it's time to introduce our speakers, and I'm delighted that we've been joined today by three of the contributing authors for the RAISE guidelines, Ella Flemyng, James Thomas, and Anna Noel-Storr. Ella is Head of Editorial Policy and Research Integrity at the Cochrane Collaboration, and she leads the team that works with the wider Cochrane community to define standards for trusted evidence synthesis, which covers the methods, the research integrity, and also publication ethics. And she's also a council member on the COPE Committee of Publication Ethics. James is Professor of Social Research and Policy and co-director of the EBI Centre at UCL in London. And I first came across James as the designer of the EBI Reviewer systematic review software. And he's also the co-senior scientific editor of Cochrane Interventions Handbook. And they obviously enjoy working together because as well as working on RAISE, they are co-investigators on the Wellcome funded Destiny project, which is creating digital infrastructure and tools to facilitate rapid evidence synthesis in climate and health, something that personally I'm interested in seeing the outcomes from. And they're also conveners of the new Joint AI Methods Group with members from Cochrane, the Campbell Collaboration, the JBI, and the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And I will let Anna give a little bit of blurb about herself, and I will pass the floor over to Ella, James, and Anna, and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane. I think, James, you're going to get the slides up, aren't you, and drive us through. While you're doing that, I'll just say hello. I think I forgot to send my bio beforehand, so I do apologise about that. So I'm Anna Noel-Storr, and I'm Cochrane's Head of Evidence Pipeline and Data Curation team, and I work closely with Ella and James on all things kind of AI related, and I'm an information specialist by background. I've been working in Cochrane for about 17 years now. So I'm not a programmer, I'm not a data scientist, I'm not an AI expert. I joined the RAISE initiative as someone, with a keen interest in producing evidence synthesis as well and as efficiently as possible using appropriate technology to do so. So I'm going to kick off first of all. James, if you could just go to the next slide for me, that would be great. Thanks very much, lovely. So I'm going to start off just with a very brief bit of context and scene setting around AI in evidence synthesis. And I am going to keep my section brief because I think you probably are all fairly well aware of the current state of play, but also because we want the bulk of this session to really focus on the RAISE guidance. And James and Ella will talk you through that once I've finished my bit. As Jane said earlier, and as James indicated, we will be having a little bit of interaction in this session using Menti. So just be ready for that. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time for some questions at the end. Okay, James, if you can move to the next slide for me, that would be great. So yeah, as I say, I'm going to have a very brief bit on AI in evidence synthesis, current context. So if you can move to the next slide for me. So health-related evidence synthesis is based on the core principles of rigor, transparency, and replicability through systematic methods. And the stakes are quite high because decisions about people's health are made on the basis of evidence synthesis. And if you can go to the next slide. But the field of evidence synthesis faces some huge challenges, one of which is information overload. With thousands of health-related articles produced each week, the sheer quantity of evidence being produced makes it difficult to keep pace and gain a true understanding of what's been done and where the gaps remain. And if you could go to the next slide for me. And so this deluge of research presents those of us trying to identify relevant evidence with a huge specificity problem. With the emphasis being on not missing relevant studies, our sensitive approach to searching means that we're often trying to pinpoint needles in giant haystacks. Coupled with questions becoming more complex, sensitive searching is resulting often in overwhelming amounts of noise to have to sift through. And if you can take me to the next slide. And I think another challenge or a lost opportunity perhaps is that the work is often done in silos, starting each review or evidence synthesis project from scratch because we're unable to easily reuse existing data. And this can result in duplication of effort and resource and research waste. In short, the process of evidence synthesis and the fact that many of the processes involved in it are largely manual has become extremely challenging and unsustainable. So could AI help to solve some of these challenges? And if you can take me to the next slide. Well, we probably first need to think about what we mean by AI. So obviously artificial intelligence is an umbrella term, and it means different things to different people. And in this context, I tend to sort of think of it in quite broad terms as ways to automate tasks and activities currently performed by humans. And if we can go to the next slide. And thinking about it in those broad terms, various forms of AI have been around for some time, at least a 70-year plus journey, starting with things like text analytics and rule-based systems, moving on to natural language processing. But it's really in the last couple of decades that techniques in machine learning have developed significantly and in a way that could constitute a step change in the evidence synthesis process. And so machine learning is essentially where a computer learns from patterns in the data it's given. And it's helpful to consider three types of machine learning: supervised, unsupervised, and then if you can take me to the next slide, James. We obviously now have generative AI into the mix, which is a form of machine learning, but feels significant enough to warrant its own bubble here. And of course, generative AI has gained a huge amount of attention across the globe. And if we can go to the next slide. And so large language models, or LLMs for short, are a specific type of generative AI that are able to recognize, summarize, translate, predict, and generate text, having been trained on vast amounts of the internet. And I think it's safe to say we're in the midst of an intense hype cycle when it comes to large language models. And if you can take me to the next slide. But without a doubt, large language models offer new potential. Not only can they possibly tackle some of the same tasks that other forms of machine learning have been trying to tackle, but with the need for far less training data, if any, they could help in tasks not previously considered feasible by more traditional forms of machine learning. So essentially, large language models have dramatically opened up the potential task space, both in terms of capacity, so to scale kind of existing tasks done by machine learning, and capability. And if you can go to the next slide. All areas of evidence synthesis production seem to be fair game when it comes to exploring the potential of generative AI, including question formulation and scoping searches, search strategy development, search results screening, both at title and abstract level and full text, data extraction, and quality assessment. However, the vast majority of studies evaluating large language models so far are small, feasibility type studies, making it often very hard or even impossible to generalize. And whilst many studies purport to demonstrate potential, the results are mixed and the implications therefore inconclusive. And if you take me to the next slide. Thank you. So in a fairly recent paper by Lieberman and colleagues aimed to provide an overview of large language model application in systematic conduct in health research. It's a great paper, and one of the figures in it is this one. And what it shows are sort of different studies evaluating the different stages within the review process. The green circles show validation studies, and the grey studies are other study designs. And along the vertical or y-axis, we have the study authors' conclusions, in which this team have categorized into three main classes. So promising, neutral, or non-promising. And if you take me to the next slide, James. And so according to Lieberman and colleagues, two of the most promising areas, those big purple circles, seem to be screening and data extraction. And that, however, when it comes to the search, we can see a definite cluster of studies where the authors of those studies felt that the large language model was not particularly promising. And that's shown by the red circle there. And if you can move to the next slide. So what are some of the challenges with large language models? Well, I'm just going to briefly touch on four that I think are particularly relevant to the use of generative AI or large language models in evidence synthesis. Overfitting, algorithmic bias, black box predictions, and hallucination. So with overfitting, this is where a model can't generalize. It fits too closely to the training data. So the model ends up regressing and making less accurate predictions. And I'm flagging this one as it has relevance when new versions of models are rolled out. So a newer version of the same large language model may not perform better. It may actually perform worse. And part of the reason could be to do with overfitting. Algorithmic bias. So I associate this one with the garbage in, garbage out adage. So mirroring and entrenching existing biases. If a model has been trained on dodgy, skewed, biased data, it's going to be a dodgy, skewed, biased model. Black box predictions. So where the explanation for the prediction is unknowable and untraceable. And in study identification stages, this potentially presents us with challenges related to replication and reporting. And then LLM hallucination happens when large language models get things wrong by making up details or presenting false information as if it were true. I mean, LLMs are not designed to pump out facts. They compose responses that are statistically likely based on patterns in their training data and on subsequent fine-tuning. So some of these errors come from ambiguities or mistakes in the AI's training data, but another category of error occurs when a user writes incorrect facts into prompts. And in these scenarios, the models tend to agree with the user. And I just read a recent piece in Nature where it was sort of described that hallucination is a feature, not a bug. And so, you know, that's what these models are not designed to pump out facts, and probably hallucination, therefore, is here to stay. One additional challenge that I haven't touched on yet is usability. And this is not a unique challenge to large language models, but a very real one nevertheless. And actually, I think ironically, part of the challenge is that a lot of the new tools incorporating generative AI and machine learning are seemingly very simple to use, making them actually very tempting to use. But until we really understand their capability, there's a lot of room for unintended error and misuse. And if you can take me to the next slide, James. And so as an information specialist myself, I have a number of things that I particularly look for. For me, when I'm looking at evaluations of models, recall remains a priority metric. And I think that's probably going to remain true for any of us working in the field of study identification. And often these evaluations will present very impressive sounding accuracy scores presented as an overall accuracy. But really what you need to do is drill down to those specific metrics that make up that accuracy score. And recall is often the one that takes priority over precision. There's also robustness of the tool or model. So do minor changes in input change the output substantially? Reproducibility and reporting, I've touched on this earlier, but being able to reproduce or replicate the study identification process is important. We also need to be able to report and document the process. And we need to know, therefore, what needs to be reported. If we're looking at new ways of conducting searches, such as using agentic searching, how best do we report the process there? And also we've got legal and ethical implications. So I'm concerned about making sure I comply with copyright and database regulations, as well as understanding the ethical implications of using AI, such as the environmental impact. And if you can take me to the next slide, James. And so it's all very well finding a seemingly great new tool, but a further challenge is how best to implement it into your workflow. And I've been involved with implementing or deploying new technology in information retrieval workflows. And these are just a few of kind of my key questions regarding enabling effective implementation. So will it potentially make a significant enough difference to current practice? Where could it be implemented? Are we talking about full replacement of an existing activity or partial replacement of a task? How could it be implemented? And how has it been endorsed or approved for use? And if you can take me to the next slide. Over the last 3 decades, we've seen a lot of change in terms of technology's role in health evidence synthesis. You know, technology has the power to both transform and to disrupt. And sometimes it can be used to improve existing processes, but every now and then a new technology comes along that has the potential to change or disrupt the existing paradigm, to make tasks and activities no longer needed. And where does generative AI sit on this scale? And if you can take me to my next slide. So I'm about to hand over to James now, so I'll just kind of conclude here by saying we have a responsibility to use AI, but only if we can use it safely and responsibly. And we believe we'll be more effective at understanding and overcoming the challenges together rather than individually, both at a methodological level, but also at a data level. And to do this, we need guidance, frameworks, and infrastructure that enables us to learn and evolve as the technology itself learns and evolves. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to James. And thank you very much, James, for moving my slides on so perfectly.
You're welcome. Thank you. and thank you all for the introduction to come and talk to you today. Um, you can see here, and I know that Ella put in the chat, that we're going to do a little bit of interactivity with Menti. So if you could go to menti.com and use this code, or if you're on a mobile device or something, click on the camera and look at the QR code, and you should be able to join Menti. So I'll leave that up just for a moment, just to see the numbers ticking up. We've got, I think it means there are about 140 of you currently on Mentimeter. Over 150. Oh, great. Somebody's found the thumbs up button. And excellent. So the thumbs ups are showing that you're online on the Mentimeter now thing. I'll just leave it up for 10 seconds more just to see if anybody else is looking at that link. The link will stay on the other pages. It's just the QR code that will go. So I will move us on. I hope. Here we go. Right. Okay. Some nice, easy questions for us to start with. I'm sure that most of the people on the call today have used none. Thank you. I was going to say most people have used one. If you haven't used an evidence synthesis tool, fine. Enter none, because that will keep that one ticking over. If you've tried some others, then do put them in the chat here. So these are names that are probably familiar to a few, though probably not everyone will know of all of them. There's a couple there that I don't think I've heard of. I've heard of most of them. So we've got ChatGPT, which I'm sure very many of us have tried out in different contexts, though possibly not everyone has used it in an evidence synthesis. Perplexity is one which is quite fun to experiment with. You don't actually have to create an account to have an experiment with Perplexity, and you can ask it research questions, and you can ask it to go and find you research papers, and it will have a go. We've got Research Rabbit, which is another of these tools, which I think you need an account to sign in for that. Undermined is another similar tool, similar to Elicit as well. Both of these aim to help with literature reviews. Elicit explicitly says systematic reviews in its marketing. And some of them have these databases which you can search. They'll retrieve literature for you. They'll then look at the literature and answer your research questions using whichever papers have been retrieved. There's the AI2 paper finder, which is an example, as Anna mentioned, of an agentic or an agent-based search. So it's not just a simple, you put in a search and it uses the keywords to find documents. You put in a search, it sort of deconstructs the search into something like Pico and then identifies records. It then screens them against the Pico and it will then present you the results. So there's quite a lot going on in some of these tools here. So this is great. It won't keep still for me long enough to note them all, but hopefully that gives you really quite a good sense that there's a lot of tools out there, and there's a lot of tools that people on the call have experimented with. So, given that we've all have looked at some of these tools, what are your biggest concerns? What do you think of? What are you worried about when you're potentially using these in your work? Or maybe you just don't use them in your work with, you're just experimenting. So hallucinations and accuracy, to fear and worries. The use of energy, the environmental impacts of all of these data centers for sure. Misinformation, inaccuracy we've got again, and black box. Reproducibility, yeah, the fact that these are stochastic devices and they don't always come up with the same results, even given the same input. Fake references, indeed, if you ask ChatGPT to come up with references for you, it's a little bit better than it was, but it'll still regularly come up with references that just don't exist. Black box, the fact that a lot of the functionality is hidden, as is the training data. Issues around copyright, the sort of like the appropriation of content in order to build these large language models. The fact that the data actually are not always very good, and they can be very, very biased, as we've got here. Lack of transparency, lack of reproducibility, lack of control. The fact that a lot of users don't know the pitfalls and drawbacks, a lot of users don't know how they work, and that's partly because, of course, the tools don't tell you how they work. Though there are some sort of basic infrastructures that it's useful to be aware of in terms of how these tools are put together. So thank you. There's lots of input here. I don't trust the outputs. Very sensible. Completeness, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because these search tools will search and retrieve records for you. A lot of them prioritize relevance over recall, and so may come up with some of the most relevant records, but often are not a complete set of records that may be relevant for answering your research question. Making librarians obsolete. It seems unlikely at the moment. Librarians are never going to be obsolete. Ability to use between the lines, sort of transparency. Brilliant. Okay, I won't read them all out because I've got some more slides for you to look at. So thank you for them. And right, okay, so a different type of a question. Do you consider yourself a tool developer? Do you build AI tools? You're a tool developer. We've got a heavy emphasis on no, I'm not a tool developer. Let this one tick up. We've got 2, 3 tool developers. The vast majority of us. Julia says we all are, aren't we? I mean, and definitely says we've trained them. Yeah, I think that's one of the points here. Okay, great. So most of us, on the whole, don't consider ourselves tool developers, and a much smaller proportion think that we are. So let's move on to the guidance. Sorry about the Menti code there. We can't quite read what it says on my slides anyway. I don't know if it helps if I make these bigger. Does it help? No, it doesn't help in at all. Okay, sorry. So the idea was, anyway, we were going to write some guidance on using AI and evidence synthesis based on evidence. Yeah, right? No, there's not very much evidence out there. What we've found is that the rate of tool development has vastly outpaced the rate of evaluation. In fact, there are loads of tools out there which, as far as we can see, have got no evaluations of them at all. So what we were finding was the impact of this in terms of the environment was that we've got a whole heap of tools which appear to be developed in almost ignorance of the way in which actually systematic reviews are done, and not understanding some of the principles on which good evidence synthesis is based. And we've got a lack of ability and a lack of guidance and a lack of sort of AI literacy across the fields in terms of critically evaluating the tools, but also taking advantage of them in terms of where we can get benefit from using these tools, because potentially there is benefit to be had. We just are not sure of how to do it. Right, okay. So this is a challenge for the whole ecosystem. And so a number of people and organizations have collaborated to produce this guidance. What we envisaged, I mean, when we first put out a sort of like initial draft of this, it was quite a lengthy document. And a lot of the feedback was that it wasn't completely clear who different elements of the guidance was aimed at, and in sort of with that feedback, and also looking at the Sense About Science work on responsible handover of AI, where they were sort of looking at how a tool developer hands, for example, a tool over to a user of the tool and that kind of thing. It made us sort of reconceptualize what we were looking at and think much more clearly about the different roles in which the system consists. The fact that there are people who do evidence synthesis, there are people who develop tools, there are people who evaluate tools, there are organizations that produce evidence synthesis, and you can see the set there. And the way that we've conceptualized this is that there are, within these discrete roles, there are sort of limits beyond which we're not expected to go. So, for example, if I'm a systematic reviewer, or I'm doing a rapid evidence assessment, whatever I'm doing, I've got enough on my plate just doing the systematic review. It's not my job at that point to start evaluating tools and testing to see whether or not they're fit for my purpose. If I'm interested in doing that, and many people who do systematic reviews are, at that point, I'm actually being a methodologist. I'm doing methodological work. So separating out the roles and responsibility of a role which I'm doing at a particular moment in time, we found was a really helpful way of thinking, okay, so this is the guidance that's needed for AI tool development teams, or for systematic reviewers or evidence synthesists, and this is the guidance that's needed for other roles, methodologists. So the same person may play multiple roles, but actually there are particular things that we need to be doing when we're performing those particular roles, A, in order to do them well, but also B, in order to support the other roles within the ecosystem. So, if I'm doing evidence synthesis, if I'm generating potentially useful data for someone who is interested in developing a tools to be able to test to see whether or not the tools are going to be fit for purpose. So there's things that I can do within my role as an evidence synthesist that can support tool development. And likewise, methodologists can support AI tool developers. So essentially, we've got this ecosystem, an interconnected ecosystem of these roles and responsibilities. And if each individual in each organization within the ecosystem plays the roles, then what we'll end up with is a sort of like a virtuous circle, where we end up with tools which are developed in line with the needs of evidence synthesists and with an evidence base to support the responsible use of those tools. So I'm not going to focus on everything today. I'm just going to focus on three particular roles: the methodologists, the evidence synthesists, and the organizations that produce evidence synthesis. And obviously there are the other roles there, and please do just refer to the race guidance if you're interested in seeing some of the others. So if I'm a reviewer or an author or an evidence synthesist, I'm doing an evidence synthesis. I think one of the really fundamental principles that we should keep to is that I'm responsible for that evidence synthesis. It's my name on it, and I'm accountable for how it was done and for the recommendations and the conclusions at the end of the report. I can't sort of offload that responsibility and say, oh, I used my AI tool of choice, and therefore it's not my fault if it's not done it right. No, it's my choice to use that tool. It's my responsibility for getting it right or wrong. So I must report the use of whichever tool I did, if I used a tool, how I used it, and you report it transparently. And this is already part of guidance. This is in the PRISMA guidance reporting standard, for example. Report the use transparently, and actually report the justification for its use. So don't just say, oh, I used this tool because I like the user interface. I've got to say, okay, I use this tool because there is a validated study which shows that it's, if I use it within these constraints, then it will perform in this way, and it will then be useful for my review. As a few of you put as concerns the ethical and legal standards in the earlier question, and that is one of the things that we really must be careful about. If we've got copyrighted content, if we've got PDFs which we've downloaded from I don't know, an Elsevier journal, Elsevier doesn't want us, and we don't have permission to sort of hand that content onto other people to help train their language models. So if we're using AI tools, we have to check, it's our responsibility to check that we're not breaking copyright, not breaking licensing standards and that kind of thing. And there's a wider debate around the ethical use and the sort of like the impact on the environment of these models as well. One little glimmer of hope there is that the size of language models which are being used and deployed in tools is actually declining now. The large models were becoming almost unusably large and undeployable, and so we're seeing a situation where the largest models are being used actually to train slightly smaller models. So long may that continue. that's, I think, it for the sort of like the main recommendations I was going to highlight on here. But there are more recommendations in the guidance, and I can see Ella's put the link in the chat there. So recommendations for methodologists. Being open about what we're doing is really important. Being really clear, writing clear scientific papers, making them replicable. The number of papers that we see coming out where there's a tool that's being developed. It might be by the same people doing the evaluation, but when you're doing an evaluation, you're behaving as a methodologist. I mean, you just can't replicate it at all. And so we've got to be really sort of careful and really quite clear that what we would like to be able to do when we're reading evaluations of tools is actually be able to replicate. So I think that's a clear principle of open science, which we're lacking at times at the moment. Committing to these impartial and objective evaluations. And obviously, it's really important that tool developers do evaluations, but it's also important that sort of third parties do impartial evaluations too. And critically here is developing the standards that are needed to use these tools, but also to communicate with developers the principles that underpin good evidence synthesis. So, for example, some of these tools will search databases that the developers have put together, and they're large databases, but they're not everything. And so one of the things that we need to be cautious about is, okay, so if I'm searching the database that's attached to this tool, what are the limitations on this database? Where else do I need to look? And then also a really fundamental principle is around publication bias, which anybody in this field will be familiar with. But things like ranking the importance of a document because it's been cited a lot is not the sort of thing that we tend to think of as a legitimate way of ranking whether or not a record is actually relevant for a review. It's not based on the sort of like the relative importance in terms of citations or the importance of the journal and that kind of thing. So those kinds of ways of selecting records shouldn't be part of the tools that we use. But at the moment, there seems to be this disconnect between tool developers, which can use these citation metrics, which seem to surface relative importance, and actually what underpins the sort of like the reliable and valid way in which evidence is synthesized. So that's the recommendations for methodologists. And I would say that one of the things that came out of discussions, came out of earlier consultations, and actually was part of the polling here, was this distinction between tool developers and us either developing prompts or using prompts in reviews. A lot of the time we think, oh, I'm just going to write I'm writing prompts here. That doesn't make me a developer. And I think probably some people in the chat said, well, actually, maybe that does. And I think it's important that when we're doing that kind of thing, we do sort of shift our mindset a little bit, because essentially what we're doing when we're writing prompts is we are creating weights which are being used in a statistical model. And of course, if you're doing that, if you're building a statistical model or altering its weights, usually you're part of a sort of like a statistical or other development group which is building a model. And of course, at that point, you're more in the sort of like the tool developer camp than actually in the I'm doing an evidence synthesis or I'm evaluating an evidence synthesis. And so at that point, you're actually performing the tool developer role, even though, in terms of how you might think of your role in the ecosystem, you might be a methodologist or you might be an evidence synthesist. So lastly, moving on to the organizations, obviously Cochrane is one. What the role of an organization is to sort of move one step beyond the evidence synthesis methodologist and actually sort of implement and ensure best practice standards are then supported, capacity is built in order to utilize AI tools in a responsible way in line with best practice standards. So the evidence synthesis does this evidence synthesis, the methodologist develops the best practice, and then the organizations implement them and support the sort of like the scaling up and the building of capacity in order to use AI tools responsibly. So promoting and monitoring the use of AI within organizations, particularly critical for organizations. So there's a 3-paper collection, which there's links in the chat to. The annoying UCL logo, which is a sort of on every slide because we're using the UCL Mentimeter, has sort of probably spoiled that QR code. So do use the link in the chat to go and see. There are 3 papers. The first is for each role, there's a set of recommendations for practice, the role that you perform, how to fulfill that role. The second paper is all about building, evaluating, and then reporting the evaluations of evidence synthesis tools, AI evidence synthesis tools. And then the last paper, paper 3, is on the selection of tools, guidance on selecting, how to select, what to do when using the tool, and sort of reflections after using an evidence synthesis tool. So that one's very, very much focused on use. And we're really interested in your feedback. On the Open Science Framework page, where the link takes you to, there is a link to take you to a form where you can fill in what you think, where there are things that are missing from the guidance, and suggestions for additions and alterations and that kind of thing. So I put one more little menti.com question in, just now that you've heard a little bit about the guidance. I'm not so sure about sort of yes, no, whether it will address some of the concerns, but I'm interested in just your responses in terms of whether the guidance will address your concerns, what needs to be in the guidance in order to address the concerns, or maybe your concerns are just unaddressable. But do feel free to use the open text responses here. Copyright is a big concern. Yeah, it is a concern. It's a concern when you're building systems and that you're wanting to sort of share data, and that kind of stops you. But also, we need to be really clear. Tools need to be really clear about whether or not they're using the content that we upload, because if they do, then obviously they're not suitable for use. Reproducibility, yeah, hopefully it will help us in the future on that. Things are moving too far. I mean, things are moving very fast. I think that's one of the problems that we've got, that the field is moving very, very quickly. There are sort of approaches to AI tools which weren't even out there in the system when we started writing the guidance. So it's a constantly moving target. And one of the things that we do intend to do is to update the guidance and to make it sort of living guidance. Copyrights is a regular concern for people. Environmental concerns. Yeah. Yeah. I'll just scroll these so that you can see some of what people are saying. Whether the guidance conflicts with guidance from the home organization. That's an interesting one. Yeah. There's no way to change the environmental footprint. Yeah, I mean, even if you're using Google search now, it must be costing more energy because it gives you that AI overview all the time. Yeah, hopefully we can narrow that gap between researchers and developers. Yeah, people ignore standards. So implementation is going to be one of the next things that we have to think about. And maybe, yeah, and organizations setting the tone for use. Brilliant. Yeah, there's a lot to read actually as well. Apologies, but there was a lot of content, a lot of ground to cover. Great. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand on, and I'm going to hand this control over to Ella now to take us through the Evidence Infrastructure Collaborative.
Great. Thanks, James. One of the other elements of this being a kind of a global international challenge so we've talked about guidance, we've talked about best practice, but it's also about the underlying infrastructure for evidence synthesis. And the Evidence Synthesis Collaborative is a Wellcome funded initiative. It was co-led by Cochrane, Campbell, and the JBI. And what they have done is created a kind of menu of options for funders who want to fund step change improvements in how evidence synthesis is done across all sectors, so wider than health, social sciences, education, environmental, etc. And next slide, please. This roadmap that they have created includes 5 steps to transformative impact. And the first step is really about this kind of underlying infrastructure. You can see on the slide here that there's six kind of parts to the infrastructure that they are calling for funding in or investment in. And under safe and responsible AI, there are 3 main kind of costed solutions as part of this roadmap. These are seen as some of the most important developments that need funding to allow us to have an infrastructure that supports responsible AI use. And so you can see those 3 areas in the purple boxes. The first is around having a governance framework that's led by the community that ensures that there is standardized validation and continuous assessment of AI systems. And that's so important. We've seen those comments about the pace of change in this area. It's going to be fundamental to kind of being able to stay on top of these AI systems and models as they develop. The second area is ensuring this infrastructure can integrate different AI tools so it can be customizable to any researcher's needs. And this is essentially about enabling interoperability and flexibility, again, 2 really crucial elements to this infrastructure being able to be kind of fit for purpose. And then third, we have creating a data store to be able to validate new AI tools. If you think about all of the kind of evidence synthesis data that you develop, one of the big challenges is what Anna was mentioning about kind of garbage in, garbage out when it comes to your kind of training, developing, and validation data. So if we can have high quality data sets that enable us to validate these tools, this will then enable us to have more confidence in using them. So yeah, they are the 3 kind of fundamental areas that the infrastructure funding is being called for as part of this initiative. Next slide, please, James. And so now I'm going to talk about the raised recommendations in practice in a bit more detail in terms of kind of how Cochrane and some of the other evidence synthesis organisations are approaching implementation, really focusing on what it means for evidence synthesis, which would also include information specialists. So next slide, please. One of the most important messages for everyone to take home is that AI and automation in evidence synthesis should be used with human oversight. AI should be seen as a companion to the synthesis and writing process, not as a replacement. Next slide, please. And so I'm just going to dig a bit deeper into the kind of ethical, regulatory, and legal considerations when using AI. As James mentioned, evidence synthesists who use an AI model or an AI function in their review, they are accountable. They're responsible for their work. They always have been. They are responsible for defining the review question, developing the search strategy, deciding what methods to use. And now that responsibility also includes the decision to use AI and how it will be used within the review. So the first step is deciding whether or not it's useful to adhere to those legal, regulatory, and ethical standards. And if it doesn't, then it's obviously a no-go. You shouldn't use the AI system. There are some there's more detail in paper 3 of the RAISE collection to help you navigate these different areas in a little bit more detail. It includes some of the considerations and some tips for you as you're kind of looking at these tools to help navigate, is it okay or should I not use this tool? So the 5 areas are around plagiarism and provenance. So how can you ensure that you don't present the work of others? So this could be their words or their data or their ideas as your own without appropriate acknowledgement. The second is all about copyright and intellectual property, which has obviously been a big kind of theme with the feedback we've had on this webinar so far. And there are really 2 areas that you need to be wary about here. The first, as we've mentioned, is that you don't breach copyright or license agreements or infringe third-party IP when uploading content to an AI system. The second is how to protect your own IP. So if you are creating content within a system, you need to make sure that you don't unintentionally assign rights of your own work to the AI system. You need to make sure that it remains your work. The third area is around jurisdiction and licensing, and this is basically about confirming you have access to the system and can use it. So, for example, some have limited rollout or may be available in specific countries first or indefinitely. And then we move on to the terms and conditions of use, and these can be tricky to navigate, but there are some specific things to consider. Again, that paper 3 in the RAISE collection goes into this in more kind of granular detail. But you want to pay particular attention to clauses around data ownership, data handling, and usage right. And this includes any reference to whether the tool trains or retains your content. So we strongly recommend that you don't use AI systems where they gain any rights to your content. So this would be the right to use, distribute, repurpose, or adapt it within their system or to train their system. You can also look for AI tools with strong privacy controls or very clear terms and conditions. I think if I come across a system where this isn't the case, I'm very wary. Ideally, we want to be using systems where you can disable data collection for training, as I've mentioned, or turn off or delete your history within the system. Organizations, it's becoming more common that organizations or institutions will have access to private or enterprise versions of AI systems, which will offer much greater privacy and security features than the kind of free or public AI systems that are out there. So that's something to keep in mind. And then we have ethical and regulatory considerations. Some of the ethical considerations might be around breaching informed consent, ensuring that there's no that you don't kind of create any risk to harm of individuals. Some of the regulatory considerations might be around data protection laws, confidentiality agreements, things like that. I think one of the big tips here is, particularly if you are peer reviewing, that anything that you are given as part of your peer reviewing, you don't upload that to an AI system, because this generally this can breach your confidentiality agreements as part of the peer review process. Okay, next slide, please, James. So next is that we recommend that evidence synthesists or information specialists can use AI as long as they can demonstrate it will not compromise on the methodological rigor or integrity of their synthesis. So during protocol development, and we do recommend that this is considered at protocol development stage, we recommend that you consider the trade-off of using AI versus not using AI. As part of this decision, you should be thinking about the context of your systematic review or your synthesis. So who will use it and what will it be used for? What your risk tolerance for errors might be in terms of affecting the findings or the conclusions, and what potential risk mitigation strategies you can put in place. So it's really important that you have really clear justification for the tools that you use, that you can demonstrate that they are methodologically sound and won't undermine the trustworthiness or reliability of your synthesis. And so this can be done by being really critical of evaluations, the evaluations of the AI system to understand their performance, and focusing on that potential impact of any errors of the system. It's also important to think about the limitations and the generalizability of the tool. And we recommend that evaluations are cited as part of this justification, as well as kind of some of this narrative around of the critique of the tool and the evaluation. Evidence synthesis also need to showcase that a tool has been validated for use in their specific evidence synthesis. So this will most likely involve something like piloting or calibrating the AI tool or system within the synthesis itself, just essentially to showcase that it won't undermine the reliability or the trustworthiness of the synthesis. This does usually require upfront investment from an author team in terms of their kind of time, their effort and skill. So again, this decision needs to be made, this trade-off decision needs to be made early on as to whether or not the effort is worth the potential gain. This is a complex area. The second and third papers of the RAISE collection include more guidance to help navigate these different elements. And the AI methods group, there's a new joint AI methods group between Cochrane, Campbell, JBI, and the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And they're really thinking about what additional guidance is needed to help evidence synthesists navigate this. So work is underway in this area. Next slide, please. Okay, and so finally, in terms of kind of what authors need to be doing in terms of justifying or you know what an author's position should be for using an AI tool, the final point here is around making sure that any judgments, any AI system that makes or suggests judgments is fully transparently reported in the manuscript. So what I mean by judgments here is anything like, is this study eligible for my review? Any appraisals, any risk and bias assessments, any judgments about what data to extract from a study, any syntheses of data from one or more studies, or even drafting of text. So that might be the text for sections such as implications for decision making or research, or it might be drafting abstracts or plain language summaries. Most journals have editorial policies now around AI generated content, and most will adhere to publishing standard reporting guidelines, which include reporting guidance on automation tool use. So here we have Cochrane's editorial policy, and we adhere to the PRISMA reporting standards, which you can also see. In general, what should be mentioned, the name and the version of the AI tool should be reported along with the dates that it was used. You should also state the purpose of using the tool and which parts of the synthesis were impacted. So best practice here might include citing or referencing user guidance, or providing reports on how it was used in your review, along with any modifications that you made. And then it comes on to this justification. And as I've mentioned, there are two crucial elements here. The first is that the tool does what it says it does and is methodologically sound. And the second is to showcase that it's appropriate to use the tool for your specific evidence synthesis. And this justification, it does what it says it does, and that you can use it in your synthesis, that is the basis for ensuring human oversight with AI use. We then recommend that within your discussion, you reflect on whether that AI use has introduced any limitations into your review processes. And this will include any potential biases. And it's helpful to kind of comment on the potential impact of any of those limitations. And then finally, if you as the evidence synthesis have any financial or non-financial interests in the tool, these should be declared, along with the tool's funding sources. Next slide, please. So these purple boxes at the top here clarify what I've just covered. These are expectations for the evidence synthesists who are using AI within their syntheses. And a position statement from the Joint AI Methods Group has just been approved, so will be available soon and covers these four areas. One of the issues that has become increasingly apparent as we've been doing this work is to meet these four criteria, particularly these two in the middle that have a red box around them. We need public and transparent information about the AI tools and the systems. And from the work we've done so far, this information is unfortunately lacking. We're therefore working with AI developers. We're working, we're open to collaborations so that we can clarify what we need from them. So far, we've seen differences in extreme reactions to these kind of requests. Some are working with us. They're investing in adhering to RAISE, so platforms like Covidence and EBI Reviewer. And then some, we ask for this information and they go absolutely silent, or they come back and say that the information isn't available because it's commercially sensitive. And to me, this seems quite extreme. I don't think, the four boxes here in blue are the things that we're asking for. Public information on the system, clear terms and conditions, ensuring that the evaluations are publicly available and transparently reported, and ensuring that the strengths, the limitations, the potential biases, and the generalizability of a tool are public. And, these clear terms and conditions are vital for ensuring that you adhere to the legal, ethical, regulatory standards. And information about the system and the scope and domains of the data that's been used for training, testing, and validation will be fundamental for understanding the strengths and the limitations of the tools, as well as how well it will apply within your syntheses. So, for example, if a tool was trained and developed on data that's similar in scope to your own synthesis, you might have more confidence in using it. But without this information, a user of the tool cannot make informed decisions about the tool. Next slide, please. And so just before I finish, something that this audience might find particularly helpful is this framework in RAISE 3, which takes you through kind of how to assess an AI tool. This framework is also what we're using to clarify with AI tool developers as to what information we need or we believe should be public and transparently available. So there are different kind of parts to this framework, different elements. The first is all around the system itself, the name, the kind of the funding sources, how the system has been developed. The second is around usability, things like the terms of use and the kind of guidance for using the tool. The third is around how the system is managed. So how can you provide feedback or flag that it doesn't work as you might have expected? And that's really important for us having confidence that they are invested and committed to continuing to develop and learn. The fourth is around how the machine learning or the AI has been developed and deployed in the system. So this includes elements about the sources of training and testing data. And based on this, that information about the strengths, limitations, and potential biases. And finally, and obviously very importantly, the validation studies and results. Okay, next slide, please. So I asked, one of my favorite things to do at the moment is to ask Google Gemini to help visualize my conclusions. And I've done it a few times, and I had a version of this image that I really liked, but I wanted to just make one small change. I wanted to add a fourth pillar to the pillars on the left. So the pillars circled on the left, I wanted to add a fourth pillar. But no matter how well I designed the prompts, how specific, how detailed I was, I couldn't reproduce this the same image with this addition, you can see that in this version, the fourth pillar is just on the right in a random place. And after spending about 20 minutes on this and becoming increasingly frustrated, I actually stepped back and thought, do you know what? This kind of underscores the message that that our message. So I've decided to leave it. And yes, to conclude, it's an exciting time in evidence synthesis. There are these global efforts to define best practice and the infrastructure that will enable us to use AI responsibly, but there are challenges that need to be addressed. There are 4 pillars that we that we think are on the priority list. The first is around defining how we can improve AI literacy across the evidence synthesis community. We need to be able to empower everyone to be able to do their part. The second is how do we embed and conduct evaluations in a coordinated way that will help build the evidence base so we can make informed decisions about whether or not to use AI in our evidence synthesis. The third is around defining how we can create and share these reusable data sets in a sustainable way so that we can support that wider adoption and evaluation of AI. And fourth, the pillar on the other side of the image, we need to increase engagement across the evidence synthesis ecosystem. As James mentioned, the RAISE recommendations are all interlinked, which means that for all of the roles, we need to participate collaboratively so that we can move forward. And yeah, so trust in research is being affected by different sources these days, and we really cannot allow AI to exacerbate these issues. We can't allow it to undermine evidence-informed decision-making. And I hope what we've showcased here today is these kind of practical efforts that aim to cut through the big tech AI hype. And I hope we've convinced you that everyone has a role to play in ensuring that as AI evolves, that we don't compromise on the core principles of rigor, transparency, and reproducibility on which evidence synthesis was built. With that, any questions? I could see the chat going off.
Before we get into questions, can I just say a big thank you to Ella and Anna and James for such a great presentation. That was a really good run through of RAISE and all the different areas that kind of feed into it and that have fed out the other end as well. So thank you very much. And yes, the chat has been going off throughout your conversation. So I will admit that I'm going to have to go back and listen myself to the YouTube recording because I was paying so much attention to the chat. And there were already some questions in there which I want to pose to you. While I am running through the chat to try and go back to the beginning, can I just remind everyone that you can put some questions in the chat, or if you're happy to ask questions yourself live, feel free to raise your hand in Zoom, and I'll come round and call your name. And apologies in advance if I get the pronunciation of your name wrong. I know that we have got people from all over the world here, and I am a British person and I'm not very good with languages other than English. So the first thing that first question or comment that I saw come up was from Kate Nyan from Yale, who said that she often sees advice like ensure that ethical guidelines are followed, but the major LLM vendors do not disclose information about the energy and water use of their data centers and the working conditions of the moderators or data workers. And in absence of the info, we need to evaluate the ethical implications of a model. What does follow ethical guidelines actually mean? Have you got any comments on that. It's something that I'm grappling with, and I'm not sure I personally am comfortable with the way that we're progressing at my institution and how we're making that distinction here.
I'm happy to go first on that one. I think I think when we say ethical considerations, sometimes we're kind of bundling ethical, legal, and regulatory considerations together. There are like the regulatory or legal considerations are things like copyright infringement, data protection, Act infringements, or kind of IP breaches. I think they're probably a bit more close. They're covered by developments that are coming out at the kind of government level in the UK, at the EU, for example. Whereas there are some that are maybe relate to best practice standards. There might be a kind of like personal standard, or it might be a standard from your organization. So, for example, if your organization is committed to net zero, for example, by a certain date, the environmental impact might be important. I think I mentioned that Raise 3 includes a section where it tries to break down these different considerations into much more kind of practical tips of how to navigate them. So I would definitely recommend having a look at those. But I think it's, being clear about what is, maybe having an idea about what is a definite no and what is a kind of a standard or a preference or or a threshold that you want for your own research or your own approaches to research.
Thank you, Ella. We had quite a bit of chat in the chat in reply to a question that Caroline de Bruin posed. What do we do if we disagree about the use of an AI tool by another member of the project team in another aspect of the review production process? Should we still agree to be a co-author?
I can take this. I think so. There are quite specific authorship criteria, and one is to put your name against it as being, taking accountability for the research. So if you're not comfortable with the manuscript, then you wouldn't be fulfilling the full authorship criteria. But I do think that sounds like an extremely tricky situation to be in, and hopefully I think that's again why I mentioned that AI use should be considered at the protocol stage. I think it's really important that a research team gets behind and agrees on how it will be used within the review or the synthesis at that early stage to prevent any of these issues kind of coming up further down the line.
Yeah, nothing further to add really. I think Ella, I was gonna mention about sort of the sooner the better that you know about it. So yes, reporting in the protocol as possible. I imagine this is something that's cropping up quite a lot now. So yeah, and I think potentially even if it is reported in the protocol, perhaps not necessarily clear to everyone on the team what was sort of meant and what would constitute as sort of it being used in earnest. So I think sometimes there's also that tricky bit around clarity of how it is going to be used, especially if it's going to be something that's used in a sort of iterative way and evolved as the review is being done.
Thank you both. I might just add my own personal views on this, facilitator's prerogative. I feel that sometimes as librarians, we are a little bit too reticent to push back with our academic colleagues about things that we may not be happy with when it comes to quality of searching. And for me, quite often I have to push quite strongly so that we adhere to the PRISMA guidelines on actually writing up and making sure that all the relevant details about the searching is in the write-up. And I'm in the fortunate position that it doesn't impact on my career or my job, that I can say, well, I want you to take me off this paper if you're not going to adhere to these guidelines. But I have found also that that works remarkably well to get people to then suddenly do what I want them to do. And I think maybe some of us as librarians need to be a little bit more comfortable with questioning things sometimes. We're being asked to contribute to systematic reviews because we have this professional knowledge. And so, in my experience, I'm treated as a fellow professional, and I'm expected to have these conversations with the other people that are in the review team. And we're not just there to make up the numbers. So yeah, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Don't underestimate the power of the librarian.
So I can't see anybody with their hand up, so I'll keep going through the chat. So Anya has put in the chat whether the RAISE guidance covers which outcomes should be the gold standard to evaluate AI tools. And I've seen that James has put a comment as a response. I don't know if you want to expand on that a bit, James?
Sorry, which question was that?
Sorry, that
can't
was
find it.
Anya's question about whether the RAISE guidance covers
Got it.
which outcomes should be the
Which
gold
outcomes?
standard.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about sort of like core outcome sets and things, which would be great. And there's actually there's a new update of the guidance which has got more metrics and more detail on evaluation outcomes. I don't think we're quite there yet, but it is definitely an area where we and others are working. So yeah, core outcome sets maybe would be a good objective here.
And the new version of that metrics section does include the environmental impact and how to measure that and approach that, which is something that's been mentioned a few times today.
Thank you. Chien's asked, you mentioned working with developers to clarify what is needed from them. I assume that includes making them aware of the assessment framework as well. And is there a way, whoops, it's jumping around just a minute. Is there a way for us to know which tools you're already in contact with and how they've reacted?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So yeah, the first kind of step that we're taking when we're approached by any AI tools is to share that framework with them, to ask for basically for them to complete it and say what's public with links and what's not public and why. This is a new area that we're navigating. Like personally, I don't think we should be initiating conversations with tool developers unless they are committed to the RAISE initiatives and adhering to the recommendations. But we appreciate that can take time. So, for example, the two I mentioned in the presentation where we've been having conversations and they're investing in updating their systems are Confidence and EPI Reviewer, but there are some other ones where we've had to kind of stop discussions because they have said information is commercially sensitive. But there are new tools popping up all the time, which makes it extremely difficult to stay on top of this. One of the things that the community was asking for was kind of like Cochrane endorsed tools, but because of the pace of change, because of the lack of clarity on the evaluations and the time it takes to assess them, that they change with every model that changes, we decided that we need the field to be more mature before we reconsider kind of having that that part within the Cochrane processes. We also were worried about like the risk of tools kind of getting endorsement and then using that as marketing and kind of, but then not adhering to the RAISE guidance. There were all these different elements that we basically kind of decided to bench that decision, that kind of work until the field is more mature.
Yeah, I think that the question on the screen as well about what's put on the table, I think is kind of in the same area as that, in that there's the checklist in the third RAISE document, which you can give to a publisher and say, how does your tool match up with what we're asking for here?
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid that is us at the end of our time already. It's flown past. Thank you again to Ella, Anna, and James for agreeing to come and talk to us and giving up your time. And thank you to everybody who has attended and who has kept the chat flowing and asked such interesting questions. I really appreciate it.